I spent 6 hours cooking Sunday dinner in my own house, and my daughter looked me straight in the eye and told me to get out because I wasn't family anymore. I smiled, untied my apron, and calmly informed her she had 30 days to vacate. My property, the house, she thought was hers but had always been in my name alone. My name is Caroline Henderson. I'm 78 years old, and I've lived long enough to learn that the hardest lessons often come from the people you love most. For 54 years, I built an empire alongside my late husband, Robert. 5 award-winning restaurants that we sold for $8 million before cancer took him from me 4 years ago. I raised 2 daughters, buried the love of my life, and spent decades believing that family meant unconditional love and sacrifice. That Sunday afternoon taught me different. It taught me that sometimes the people who share your blood can treat you worse than strangers ever would. And it taught me that a mother's love, no matter how deep, should never mean allowing yourself to be disrespected in your own home. What happened that day didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of small cruelties, growing entitlement, and my own inability to see what my daughter had become. But when she finally crossed that line, when she screamed at me to leave, while her husband smirked and his parents laughed, something crystallized inside me. Not anger, not even hurt, just absolute clarity. I'm going to tell you exactly how a 70-year-old widow who spent her life cooking for family ended up evicting her own daughter, how a mother's generosity turned into a weapon used against her, and how I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to stop giving. If you've ever wondered whether there's a limit to what a parent should endure, or if you've ever felt taken for granted by the people you've sacrificed everything for, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, because this story gets much deeper than one bad Sunday dinner. And I'd love to know I'm not alone in this. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Something tells me there are more grandmothers out there with stories like mine than anyone wants to admit. Let me take you back to where it really started. The warning signs were there long before that Sunday. I just didn't want to see them. When Robert died 4 years ago, I thought grief would be the hardest thing I'd ever face. We'd been married since I was 24 years old, 54 years of building something together, of Sunday dinners and restaurant openings and grandchildren's birthdays. He died at 76, and I became a widow at 74, and suddenly the world felt impossibly large and empty. Melissa came to the funeral. Of course, she cried. She hugged me. She told me she'd always be there for me. But within weeks, something shifted. I didn't recognize it at first because grief makes everything blurry, makes you question your own perceptions. But looking back now with clear eyes, I can see exactly when my daughter stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as an obstacle. It started with the house. 5 years ago, when Melissa married Preston, they were struggling. He worked in tech sales or claimed to, and she was between jobs as usual. They couldn't afford a down payment, couldn't qualify for a mortgage, and Melissa came to me with tears in her eyes asking for help. Not alone, help. As if there was a difference. Robert and I discussed it over coffee one morning in our kitchen. He was already sick by then, though we didn't know how sick. He stirred his coffee slowly and said something I should have paid more attention to. He told me that Preston gave him a bad feeling, that there was something off about a man in his late 30s who'd never managed to build anything for himself. He told me that if we were going to help, we needed to protect ourselves. So we bought the house. $750,000 for a beautiful 4-bedroom property in a good San Diego neighborhood. But Robert insisted, and I mean absolutely insisted, that the deed go in my name only, not joint with Melissa, not with some kind of transfer arrangement, just mine. Melissa was furious when she found out. She didn't yell, she never yelled back then, but her voice got cold in that way that reminded me uncomfortably of my own mother. She asked me why I didn't trust her. She wanted to know what she'd ever done to deserve this lack of faith. Preston stood behind her with his arms crossed, and I remember thinking how much he looked like a man calculating something. I tried to explain it wasn't about trust. I told her the house was safer this way, that she and Preston could live there rent-free, that it was still an incredible gift. What difference did the name on the deed make? But she wouldn't let it go. For weeks, she barely spoke to me. Robert told me to stand firm, and I did. Eventually she seemed to accept it. She moved in. She decorated. She hosted parties and posted photos on social media of her beautiful home. I never corrected her in public. What would be the point? She was my daughter, and I wanted her to be happy. For a while after Robert died, things were almost normal. Melissa called to check on me. She invited me over for Sunday dinners, continuing the tradition Robert and I had maintained for decades, but she never cooked. She'd ordered takeout or have Preston grill something, and I'd sit at the table in the house I'd bought feeling like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. So I started cooking again. I'd arrive Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock with bags of groceries, ingredients for pot roast or roasted chicken or Robert's favorite lamb dish. I'd spend 6 hours in that kitchen doing what I'd done my entire adult life, creating meals that brought people together. It was the only way I knew how to show love, the only way I knew how to keep Robert alive in some small way. At first, Melissa seemed grateful. She'd thank me and tell me how much she missed my cooking. Preston would eat without comment, which I took as approval, but gradually, something changed. The gratitude disappeared. The thanks stopped coming. I'd arrive to find them annoyed by my presence, as if I was interrupting something. Preston started making comments. Little digs about how I came over every single week, about whether I had my own life, about how they were adults now and didn't need a mother hovering. Melissa would laugh, not the warm laugh I remembered from her childhood, but something brittle and mean. Sometimes she'd join in, asking me if I didn't have friends my own age to spend time with. I ignored it because that's what mothers do. We absorb the small cruelties and tell ourselves, it's just stress, just a bad day, just temporary. We make excuses because the alternative, admitting that our children have become people we don't recognize, is too painful. Then, 6 months ago, Preston told Melissa he wanted his parents to move in with them. Gerald and Patricia were getting older, he explained, and they needed family support. Never mind that they lived in a mansion in Loyola and had more money than God. Never mind that they'd spent their entire lives treating service workers like dirt and looking down on anyone who'd actually worked for a living. They were family, and family came first. Melissa agreed immediately. She didn't ask me what I thought. She didn't consider that this was technically my house they were filling with people who'd never shown me anything but contempt. She just told me one Sunday that her in-laws would be moving in, and that I should probably start calling before I came over. Gerald and Patricia moved in 3 weeks later, and that's when Sunday dinners became unbearable. The first Sunday after they arrived, I showed up at my usual time with bags of groceries. Patricia opened the door in a silk robe and looked at me like I was selling something door to door. She asked me what I was doing there. I reminded her it was Sunday dinner day, and she actually rolled her eyes before letting me in. I cooked for 5 hours that day, made a standing rib roast, scalloped potatoes, green beans with almonds, fresh rolls, and apple pie. The kind of meal that takes skill and time and love. When I called everyone to the table, Gerald sat down and immediately criticized the temperature of the meat. Patricia picked at her food and mentioned that she preferred modern cuisine, whatever that meant. Preston smirked into his wineglass, and Melissa, my daughter, my child, said nothing in my defense. I went home that night and cried for the first time since Robert's funeral, not because of the criticism. I'd run restaurants for decades. I could handle criticism, but because of the absence of gratitude, of basic human decency, of respect for a 70-year-old woman who'd just spent her entire day creating something beautiful for people who couldn't even pretend to appreciate it. I should have stopped going then. I should have recognized that I was clinging to a tradition that no one else valued. But I kept thinking about Robert, about all those Sunday dinners when our table was full of laughter and love. I kept thinking that if I just tried hard enough, if I just kept showing up, maybe I could bring that feeling back. I was wrong. The next few months were a slow erosion of whatever relationship Melissa and I had left. Every Sunday, I'd arrive to hostile faces. Every Sunday, I'd cook while Gerald complained about the noise. Patricia made snide comments about old people not knowing when they weren't wanted. And Preston invented new ways to make me feel small. And every Sunday, Melissa stood by and let it happen. The photos came down first. Robert and I had given Melissa several beautiful family portraits over the years, pictures from our restaurant openings, from her childhood, from her wedding day. They'd always hung in the living room, but gradually, they disappeared, replaced by photos of Preston's family, of Gerald and Patricia, of everyone except me. I noticed, but I said nothing. What could I say? It was her house, even though we both knew the truth. Then came the Sunday 3 weeks ago, when I arrived to find my key didn't work. They'd changed the locks. Melissa answered my knock and explained that Preston thought it was safer this way. What with his parents' valuable jewelry in the house, She handed me a new key, but the message was clear. I was no longer trusted, no longer family, just an intruder who needed to be controlled. I took that key, and I kept coming back, because I'm 78 years old, and I've survived things these people can't imagine, and I wasn't going to let their pettiness break me. I kept thinking about what Robert would say. He'd tell me to stand tall, to remember my worth, to never let anyone, not even my own daughter, make me feel less than I was. But I was tired, so deeply tired. Tired of being treated like an inconvenience in my own house. Tired of cooking for people who acted like I was poisoning them. Tired of watching my daughter transform into someone I didn't recognize. That last Sunday, I should have known something was different. When I arrived, Melissa's car was in the driveway, along with Preston's, and an unfamiliar Mercedes that I assumed belonged to one of their friends. The door was unlocked, so I let myself in with that new key they'd grudgingly given me. The living room had been redecorated again. Every single photo of Robert was gone. In their place were enormous portraits of Gerald and Patricia from what looked like their country club, and a massive family tree of Preston's lineage going back 5 generations. It was like our family, my family, had never existed. I stood there staring at those photos for longer than I should have, grocery bags cutting into my 70-year-old hands, and for the first time, I let myself think the thought I'd been avoiding for months. My daughter was erasing me. Slowly, methodically, she was removing every trace of the woman who'd given her life, who'd bought her this house, who'd loved her unconditionally for 43 years. I should have left right then, should have put down those groceries, walked out that door, and never come back. But I didn't. Instead, I went to the kitchen and started cooking. Because that's what I do. That's what I've always done. Even when it hurts, even when it's not appreciated, even when every instinct tells me I'm making a terrible mistake. I made Robert's favorite dish that day. Lamb roast with rosemary and garlic, exactly the way he taught me 50 years ago. I made it perfectly crispy on the outside, pink and tender inside. I made his mother's potato recipe, the one she gave me when we got married. I made everything with the kind of care and precision that comes from decades of feeding people who actually loved me. At 5 o'clock, I set the table, used the good china I'd given Melissa for her wedding, the set that had belonged to Robert's grandmother, put out fresh flowers from my garden, made everything beautiful because that's what Sunday dinner deserved. Then I called everyone to eat. Melissa came down the stairs first, followed by Preston. Then Gerald and Patricia emerged from what used to be the guest room, my guest room, looking annoyed that dinner was being served at a specific time. They all sat down at the table I'd set in the house I owned, and I waited for someone to acknowledge the hours of work I'd just put in. No one said a word, not even a simple thank you. I served the lamb. I passed the potatoes. I poured the wine. And I watched as they all began eating without a single word of gratitude, as if I was staff hired to feed them. That's when Melissa cleared her throat and said we needed to talk. And when she opened her mouth and told me that Preston and she had decided I couldn't come anymore, that this was their house and their family now, that I needed to leave and not come back unless specifically invited, that's when something inside me didn't break. It crystallized, because in that moment, watching my daughter dismiss me in my own home, while her entitled husband smirked and his awful parents nodded approval, I finally understood what Robert had seen 5 years ago. I finally understood why he'd insisted on keeping that deed in my name. He'd known, somehow, he'd known that this day would come. That the daughter we'd raised and loved and sacrificed for would eventually decide her mother was disposable. And he'd made sure that when that day came, I wouldn't be left powerless. I looked at Melissa really, looked at her, and I didn't see my little girl anymore. I saw a stranger, a cruel, entitled stranger, who'd been living in my house, eating my food, and spending 4 years figuring out how to get rid of me permanently. Preston told me I'd heard my daughter and needed to leave. Gerald actually laughed and said something about finally having peaceful Sundays. Patricia waved her hand dismissively and told me to make sure I cleaned the pans before I left. And that's when I smiled. Not a warm smile, not a mother's smile. The smile I used to give restaurant suppliers who tried to cheat me, or competitors who thought they could steal my recipes, or anyone foolish enough to underestimate a woman who'd built an empire from nothing. I untied my apron slowly, taking my time, watching confusion creep across their faces. Then, I looked at my daughter and said the words that changed everything. I told her she was absolutely right. I wasn't family. I was the owner. And they all had 30 days to get out of my house. The silence that followed my words was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in 4 years. Melissa's face went from smug satisfaction to absolute white in the span of 2 seconds. Her mouth opened and closed like she'd forgotten how to form words. Preston's smirk vanished so quickly you'd think someone had slapped it off his face. Gerald stopped mid-chew, a piece of my perfectly cooked lamb suspended on his fork. And Patricia actually dropped her wineglass. It shattered on the hardwood floor I'd paid for, red wine spreading across the boards like blood. Melissa finally found her voice. She asked me what I was talking about, what I meant by my house. Her tone was that of someone who already knew the answer but desperately wanted to be wrong. I pulled out my phone. Yes, I know how to use a smartphone. I'm 78, not dead end. Showed her the photo I'd kept saved in my documents folder for 5 years. The property deed, crystal clear, legally binding, with my name and only my name on the ownership line. I told her very calmly that this house had never been hers, that I'd purchased it, that the deed had always been in my name alone, that she and Preston had been living here as my guests for 5 years. Guests who, I noted, had never paid a single dollar in rent, utilities, or property taxes. Preston stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He tried to tell me I couldn't do this, that they had rights, that they'd lived here for 5 years and that meant something legally. I almost laughed. Almost, because this man who'd spent months making me feel unwelcome in my own property actually thought he could intimidate a woman who'd negotiated with commercial landlords, dealt with health inspectors, and run 5 successful restaurants in one of the most competitive markets in California. I informed him that without a lease agreement, without having paid rent, without any legal documentation giving them tenant rights, they were essentially squatters. Squatters I was generously giving 30 days to vacate. I told him my attorney would be delivering formal eviction papers first thing Monday morning. Gerald finally spoke up. He said this was absurd, that I wouldn't actually evict my own daughter. His face was red, that dangerous shade of red men his age get right before their hearts give out. Part of me wondered if I should be concerned. The rest of me remembered every condescending comment, every eye roll, every moment he'd treated me like help in my own home. I looked at him directly and told him that his son and my daughter had just informed me I wasn't family and ordered me to leave my own property, so yes, I would absolutely evict them. And as for him and Patricia, they were guests of guests, which meant they had even less standing. They'd be leaving too. I picked up my purse, left my apron on the counter, and walked toward the door. Behind me, I could hear Melissa starting to cry, Preston yelling something about lawyers, Patricia shrieking about the injustice of it all. I didn't turn around, I just kept walking. But before I left, I said one more thing. I told them to enjoy the dinner I'd spent 6 hours preparing. It would be the last meal I ever cooked in that house. The drive home to my condo, the small 2-bedroom place I'd bought after Robert died, should have felt triumphant. Instead, I cried the entire way, not because I regretted what I'd done, but because it had come to this. Because the little girl I'd rocked to sleep, whose skinned knees I'd bandaged, whose wedding I'd paid for, that little girl had grown into a woman who could look me in the eye and tell me I wasn't family. I pulled into my parking space and sat in the car for 20 minutes, letting the tears come. I'm 78 years old, and I've learned that sometimes you have to let yourself break down before you can build yourself back up. Robert used to tell me that strength wasn't about never crying, it was about crying when you needed to. Then getting up and doing what had to be done anyway. When I finally went inside, I made myself a cup of tea, expensive loose-leaf kind Robert and I used to share on Sunday evenings after the restaurant closed. I sat at my small kitchen table, and I let myself remember when Melissa was small, when she'd climb into my lap and beg me to read her the same story 5 times in a row, when she'd help me in the restaurant kitchen, standing on a step stool to reach the counter, seriously stirring whatever I put in front of her. Where had that little girl gone? When had she become this stranger? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I did something I should have done months ago. I went through my files. I keep meticulous records, a habit from decades of running businesses, and I started documenting everything. I found the original property deed from 5 years ago. I found the title insurance documents. I found every property tax payment I'd made, all from my account, all in my name. I found utility bills going back 5 years, every single one paid by me. I even found the home insurance policy, which listed me as the sole owner and Melissa and Preston as residents. Then, I started going through my bank statements, and that's when I found something that made my blood run cold. 3 months ago, there had been a wire transfer from my savings account. $50,000. I stared at that transaction for a full minute before I remembered. Melissa had called me crying, said they had an emergency, that Preston's car had been totaled and they needed to replace it immediately for his job. She'd begged me not to tell Preston, said it would hurt his pride. Like a fool, I'd transferred the money that same day. I kept digging through the statements. Found another transfer from 6 months before that, $25,000. That one had been for unexpected medical bills that Melissa said weren't covered by insurance. I pulled up 2 years' worth of statements. The pattern was clear. Every few months, there was a transfer to Melissa. Always with an emergency justification. Always with her begging me not to mention it to Preston. The amounts ranged from $5,000 to $50,000. I added them up 3 times because I couldn't believe the number. Over the past 2 years, I'd given my daughter $190,000. $190,000 that I'd never asked about, never questioned, never expected to be repaid, because she was my daughter, and you help your children when they're in need. Except I was starting to understand that maybe she'd never been in need. Maybe this was just another way of taking from the mother she'd already decided wasn't family. Monday morning, I called Richard Chen at exactly 9 o'clock. Richard had been our attorney since Robert and I opened our second restaurant 32 years ago. He was 65 now, semi-retired, but he'd told me after Robert's funeral that if I ever needed anything at Alley should call him directly. I told him what had happened, every detail, the years of disrespect, the changed locks, the in-laws moving in, and finally, the dinner where my own daughter had ordered me out of my own house. I told him I wanted them evicted, and I wanted it done by the book. No room for challenges, no loopholes, nothing they could use to delay or fight. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said something that surprised me. He told me he'd been waiting for this call. He said Robert had come to see him about 6 months before he died, had updated his will and made some specific arrangements regarding the house. Robert had been worried, Richard explained, worried about Preston's influence on Melissa, worried about my tendency to be too generous, worried that I'd be taken advantage of after he was gone. My husband had been protecting me even from the grave. Richard told me he'd have eviction papers prepared immediately. California law required 30 days' notice for month-to-month occupancy, which is what Melissa and Preston technically had since they'd never signed a lease. He asked if I was sure about this, if I understood that Melissa would probably never forgive me. I told him I was certain. And as for forgiveness, you can't lose something you never really had. The papers were delivered by a process server at 2 o'clock Monday afternoon. I know because Melissa called me exactly 7 minutes later, screaming so loudly I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She said I was destroying her life, that I was a vindictive old woman, that she couldn't believe her own mother would do this to her. I let her scream herself out. When she finally paused for breath, I asked her one simple question. Did she or did she not tell me I wasn't family and order me out of the house? She tried to backtrack, claimed she'd been stressed, that she hadn't meant it that way, that I was taking things too literally. She said Preston's parents had been pressuring them about space and she'd just reacted badly. She begged me to understand. I told her I understood perfectly. I understood that for months, maybe years, she'd been looking for a way to push me out. I understood that she'd taken nearly $200,000 from me while planning to discard me. And I understood that the only reason she was sorry now was because she'd finally realized I held all the cards. She went quiet. Then she said something that confirmed everything I'd been suspecting. She told me that Preston had lost his job. Not recently, 3 months ago. They were broke. Completely broke. They'd burned through their savings, maxed out their credit cards, and the only thing keeping them afloat was the fact that they had no rent or mortgage payment. Preston's parents hadn't moved in to be closer to family. They'd moved in because Preston and Melissa had been planning to ask them for money, and Gerald had agreed on the condition that he and Patricia could keep an eye on their investment. The whole thing suddenly made horrible sense. Preston and Melissa needed financial support. Gerald and Patricia had money but wanted control. Together, they'd decided the easiest solution was to get rid of me, the inconvenient old woman who technically owned everything, and transform the house into their own little kingdom funded by Preston's parents. I'd been the obstacle in their plan, so they'd tried to remove me. I asked Melissa why she hadn't just told me the truth. why she hadn't come to me honestly and explained that they were struggling. I would have helped. I always helped. Her answer broke what was left of my heart. She said Preston didn't want to be indebted to an old woman, and that Gerald had convinced them they'd be better off making their own way. She said they'd thought if they could just get me to stop coming around, they could eventually convince me to sign the house over to them, and then everything would be fine. They'd been planning this for months. They'd been deliberately making me feel unwelcome, deliberately trying to drive me away, so they could manipulate me into giving up the one piece of leverage I had. And the cruelest part, if they'd just been honest, if Melissa had come to me and admitted they were struggling, I probably would have helped. I might even have transferred the house to her name eventually, because despite everything, she was still my daughter. But they hadn't trusted me with the truth. They'd chosen manipulation over honesty, cruelty over vulnerability, and now they were facing the consequences. I told Melissa that she had 29 days left. Then, I hung up. Over the next week, the calls kept coming. Preston tried reasoning with me, explaining about job markets and bad luck. Gerald called, threatening lawsuits. Apparently, he'd consulted with his own attorney, who'd confirmed I was completely within my legal rights, which made him even angrier. Patricia left a voicemail calling me a bitter old witch who was jealous of their happy family. I blocked all their numbers. I'd said what needed to be said, but I wasn't done digging. Something about the timeline bothered me. Preston had lost his job 3 months ago, right around the time of that $50,000 emergency. I logged into my bank account and looked at the transfer details more carefully. The memo line, which I hadn't noticed before, read, "Car replacement accident," but there was no insurance claim. And Preston was still driving the same BMW he'd had for 2 years. I called my bank and asked for copies of all transfers to Melissa's account over the past 2 years. When they arrived, I went through each one methodically, matched them against her explanations, and realized that not a single emergency she'd described had actually been real. The medical bills. I checked with my health insurance. I'd kept Melissa on my plan until she turned 26, and I still had access to those records. No major medical expenses in the time frame she'd claimed. The car accident never happened. No police report, no insurance claim, nothing. The roof repair from 8 months ago. I'd hired an inspector to check the house after they moved in. The roof was only 7 years old and in perfect condition. Every single emergency had been a lie. Every desperate call, every tearful plea, all of it designed to extract money from the mother who loved her too much to ask questions. $190,000 stolen from me with false emergencies and manufactured crises. All while they were plotting to take the house to. I sat in my condo that night, surrounded by bank statements and property documents, and I felt something I'd never felt before toward my daughter. Not anger, not even betrayal, just a cold, clear understanding that the child I'd raised no longer existed. And mourning her, mourning who she should have been, was pointless. Robert had known this would happen. Somehow, sitting in that attorney's office while cancer ate away at him, he'd known our daughter would turn out like this, and he'd made sure I'd be protected when she did. I made a decision that night. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about making sure that everyone knew exactly what Melissa had done. Not for revenge, I'm too old for revenge, but because there's a principle at stake. A principle about respecting the people who gave you everything, about honoring the sacrifices your parents made, about basic human decency that should exist even when there's no legal obligation. I called Richard the next morning and asked him to do 3 things. First, document every transfer I'd made to Melissa over the past 5 years. I wanted a complete accounting. Second, prepare an amendment to my will that would make my intentions crystal clear. And third, send a letter to Melissa informing her that the 30-day eviction notice was final, no negotiations, and that any further contact would be considered harassment. Richard asked if I was sure about the will change. I told him I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Then I did something I hadn't done in the 4 years since Robert died. I called my other daughter, Andrea, in Florida. We'd drifted apart after Robert's funeral, not from any conflict, but just the natural distance that happens when one daughter lives across the country. Andrea had her own family, her own life, and I hadn't wanted to burden her with my problems. But she deserved to know what was happening. And maybe I needed to hear from the daughter, who'd actually turned out right. Andrea answered on the second ring. When I told her what had happened, she was quiet for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Then she said something that made me realize I'd been wrong about so many things. She told me this didn't surprise her at all. She said Melissa had always been like this, entitled, manipulative, willing to take advantage of anyone who showed her kindness. She told me about incidents from their childhood that I'd dismissed or excused, patterns of behavior I'd been too blind to see. Then, Andrea told me she'd stopped coming home for holidays 3 years ago because of Melissa. That the last time she'd visited, Melissa had cornered her and tried to get her to convince me to transfer the house deed. When Andrea refused, Melissa had said horrible things about our mother, about me, calling me controlling and manipulative, and saying that I kept the house in my name to maintain power over her. My younger daughter had witnessed the truth I'd been too close to see. And rather than force me to choose, rather than create family drama, she'd simply quietly removed herself from the situation. I apologized to Andrea through tears, apologized for not seeing the truth sooner, for letting Melissa's behavior drive a wedge between us, for being a mother who'd enabled one daughter while neglecting the other. Andrea told me there was nothing to apologize for. She said mothers always try to see the best in their children. But she also said something I needed to hear, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their choices. We talked for 2 hours. She told me about her life, her kids, my grandchildren, who I barely knew because I'd been so focused on trying to maintain a relationship with Melissa. She told me she'd be coming to visit next month, and that she wanted to start rebuilding what we'd lost. For the first time since that terrible Sunday dinner, I felt something other than anger or grief. I felt hope. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal documentation and refused calls. Melissa tried every tactic in the book: guilt, anger, bargaining, threats. Preston's parents apparently consulted with 3 different attorneys, all of whom told them the same thing. I was the legal owner. I had the right to evict, and they had no case. I spent those weeks preparing for what came next. I met with real estate agents to discuss listing the house. I researched moving companies to help with Melissa's belongings if she didn't clear out in time, and I revised my will, making it explicitly clear that Melissa would receive nothing, not the house, not money, not even sentimental items. Everything would go to Andrea and to charities Robert and I had supported over the years. Richard suggested I might want to reconsider, that cutting Melissa out completely was harsh. I asked him if he thought $200,000 in lies and a daughter telling her mother she wasn't family was harsh. He didn't bring it up again. On day 28, Melissa showed up at my condo. I saw her through the window, standing at my door. And for a moment she looked like she did when she was 7 years old, small and scared and needing her mother. But I didn't open the door, because I knew what she looked like now, and it wasn't that little girl. It was a 43-year-old woman who'd spent years taking advantage of her mother's love, who'd lied and manipulated and stolen, and who was only here now because she'd finally run out of options. She knocked for 10 minutes. Then she left an envelope tucked into my doorframe and walked away. Inside was a handwritten letter, 3 pages of apologies and explanations and pleas for understanding. She admitted to lying about the emergencies. She admitted that Preston had pressured her to get me to sign over the house. She admitted that bringing his parents in had been part of a plan to make me so uncomfortable I'd leave on my own. She said she was sorry, said she'd made terrible mistakes, said she loved me and needed me to forgive her. At the bottom of the letter, she'd written one more thing. Please, Mom, we have nowhere to go. Preston can't find work. We'll be homeless. I read that letter 3 times. Then, I put it in a folder with all the other documentation of my daughter's betrayal, and I called Richard to confirm that everything was proceeding as planned. Because here's what 78 years of life had taught me. Sometimes people are sorry they did something wrong, and sometimes they're just sorry they got caught. Melissa had 2 days left. On day 29, I did something that surprised even myself. I called Melissa and told her I wanted to meet, not at my condo, not at the house, at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between us, the kind of place with too bright lighting and uncomfortable chairs that discourage long conversations. I needed her to think she still had a chance. I needed her to believe that maybe, just maybe, her mother's heart was softening. Because I'd realized something important during those sleepless nights reviewing bank statements and property documents. I didn't have the full picture yet. There were still pieces missing, transfers that didn't quite add up, timeline gaps I couldn't explain, and the nagging question of exactly how deep this betrayal went. So I was going to do what I'd done for 50 years running restaurants. I was going to smile, play the role expected of me, and extract every piece of information I needed. Melissa arrived 15 minutes early. I watched her through the window before going in. She looked terrible. Hair unwashed, no makeup, clothes wrinkled like she'd slept in them. Part of me felt that old maternal instinct to fix it, to make it better. But I pushed it down and walked inside. She stood when she saw me, and I could see hope flooding her face. She actually thought this meeting meant forgiveness was coming. I let her keep thinking it. We sat down, and I ordered tea while she got some complicated coffee drink that cost more than my entire lunch would have. Even broke, she still had expensive tastes. I noted that detail and filed it away. I opened the conversation gently, told her I'd read her letter, that I'd been thinking a lot about everything. I let my voice shake just slightly, not hard to do, since I was 78 and genuinely exhausted. I wanted her to see a tired old woman who might be weakening, not the steel-spined businesswoman I actually was. She took the bait immediately, started apologizing again, explaining how Preston had changed after losing his job, how his parents had manipulated both of them, how she'd gotten caught up in something she couldn't control. Every word was designed to shift blame away from herself. I nodded sympathetically and asked her to help me understand the timeline. When exactly had Preston lost his job? She told me it was 3 months ago. He'd been let go during company downsizing. I asked if he'd received severance. She hesitated, then said yes, about $30,000. Interesting. That meant they'd had money 3 months ago. So why had she called me for that emergency, $50,000, the same week he was let go? I didn't challenge her directly. Instead, I played confused old woman, struggling to remember details. I mentioned that I thought she'd called about a car emergency right around that time. Was I remembering wrong? Melissa's face did something complicated. She explained that yes, they'd needed the car money because Preston's severance had to go toward other debts. Credit cards, she said. They'd been living beyond their means for a while. I asked how long. How long had they been struggling before Preston lost his job? She looked down at her coffee. More than a year, she admitted. Maybe closer to 2 years. Preston's salary hadn't been as high as they'd let people believe, and his commissions had dried up long before he was actually fired. They'd been drowning in debt, trying to maintain appearances, and every month they fell further behind. Now we were getting somewhere. I kept my voice gentle, my expression concerned. I told her I wished she'd been honest with me from the start, that I would have helped if I'd known the truth. She actually started crying, said Preston wouldn't let her tell me, that he was too proud, that his parents had convinced him that asking an elderly woman for help was shameful. She said Gerald had promised to bail them out if they could just get me to sign over the house. That way Preston's parents could use the equity as collateral for a business loan they wanted to give him. There it was, the full picture, tumbling out of my daughter's mouth between sobs. Gerald and Patricia hadn't moved in out of family obligation. They'd moved in as part of a business arrangement, give them access to the house equity, and they'd fund Preston's next venture. My home was going to be collateral for a business loan for a man who'd just been fired from his last job, and they'd all agreed that the easiest way to make this happen was to manipulate an old woman into signing away her property. I reached across the table and patted Melissa's hand, the same way she used to pat mine when she was pretending I was too confused to understand what was happening. I told her I appreciated her honesty, that it helped me understand. She looked up with such desperate hope in her eyes. She asked if this meant I might reconsider the eviction, if maybe we could work something out. I told her I needed time to think, that this was all very complicated and I needed to process everything. I suggested we meet again in a few days, after the 30-day deadline, to discuss possibilities. She agreed immediately, thanked me over and over, actually hugged me before she left, whispering that she knew I'd understand, that I'd always been such a good mother, that family forgives family. I watched her walk back to her Carnot, the BMW that Preston supposedly still owned, but a beat-up Honda I didn't recognize, probably borrowed or rented. More evidence of just how broke they actually were. I sat in that coffee shop for another hour, drinking my tea and thinking about what I'd learned. The manipulation had been even more calculated than I'd realized. This wasn't just about entitlement or disrespect. This was a coordinated scheme involving my daughter, her husband, and his parent Saul, working together to defraud a 78-year-old woman out of her property. They'd underestimated me at every turn, assumed that age meant weakness, that being a mother meant being a pushover. that grief over losing Robert had made me vulnerable and easy to manipulate. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. I called Richard from the coffee shop parking lot, told him about the meeting, about the business loan scheme, about Gerald and Patricia's involvement. I asked if their plan would have worked if I'd signed over the house. Could they have used it as collateral without my knowledge? Richard explained that if I'd transferred the deed, yes, the new owners could have taken out loans against the property. I would have had no legal standing to stop them. If Preston's business venture had failed, the house could have been foreclosed on, and I would have lost everything Robert and I had worked for. My daughter and her in-laws had been planning to steal my home and risk everything my late husband had built, all while pretending to care about family. I thanked Richard and told him to proceed with everything exactly as planned. No delays, no negotiations, no mercy. Tomorrow was day 30, and tomorrow, Melissa would learn that underestimating a widow who'd spent 50 years running successful businesses in one of the toughest industries in America was the biggest mistake she'd ever made. Day 30 arrived with the kind of bright California sunshine that feels almost mocking when your world is falling apart. Except my world wasn't falling apart. Lissa's was. I woke up at 5 in the morning, made myself Robert's favorite breakfast: scrambled eggs with chives, toast with real butter, strong black coffee, and sat at my kitchen table, reviewing everything one last time. Richard had scheduled the official eviction enforcement for 10 o'clock. A sheriff's deputy would be there to ensure peaceful removal of belongings and to confirm that Melissa, Preston, Gerald, and Patricia had vacated the property. I'd told Melissa we'd meet in a few days to discuss possibilities. I'd let her believe that her tearful confession at the coffee shop had softened my resolve. Let her think that her elderly mother was too weak-hearted to follow through. She was about to discover otherwise. But before the eviction, I needed to do one more thing. I needed to understand the full scope of what they'd planned, not just what they'd already done, but what they'd intended to do if they'd succeeded. I called Andrea at 6 in the morning California time, which meant 9 in Florida. She answered immediately, her voice concerned. I told her I needed her to do something for Mizafi. That might seem strange, but that I needed for my own peace of mind. I asked her if she remembered Gerald's business, the car dealership chain that Preston's family was supposedly so proud of. Andrea confirmed she did. Preston had bragged about it constantly during family gatherings. I asked her to do some research for me. Look up the business, check public records, see what she could find about their financial situation. Andrea called me back within 2 hours. What she'd discovered made everything even clearer. Gerald's dealership chain was failing, badly. 3 of his 5 locations had closed in the past 18 months. The remaining 2 were barely hanging on. There'd been a lawsuit from a former business partner claiming fraud, multiple liens filed against the properties. The family that Preston had always presented as wealthy and successful was actually drowning in debt. Gerald and Patricia hadn't moved in to help their son out of generosity. They'd moved in because they were broke and needed somewhere to live rent-free while they figured out how to salvage their failing business, and the equity in my $7,150,000 house, a house that had probably appreciated to over $800,000 by now, represented a lifeline they desperately needed. That's why Gerald had been so hostile to me from the start. That's why Patricia had treated me like an inconvenient obstacle. I wasn't just in the way of their son's comfort, I was standing between them and financial survival. The whole family had been planning to use my property to bail themselves out of their own failures. Preston had probably lost his job because of performance issues related to his family's financial stress. Melissa had married into what she thought was money, only to discover she'd actually married into debt and desperation. And rather than admit any of this, rather than ask for help honestly, they'd decided to manipulate and steal from an old woman who'd already given them everything. I called Richard and shared what Andrea had found. He was quiet for a long moment, then asked me a question I hadn't expected. He wanted to know if discovering that they were desperate, genuinely desperate, changed how I felt about proceeding. I thought about it honestly. Did it change anything, knowing they weren't just greedy but actually drowning? And I realized it didn't, because desperation doesn't excuse cruelty. Financial stress doesn't justify manipulation. And there's a world of difference between asking for help and orchestrating an elaborate scheme to defraud someone. If Melissa had come to me a year ago and said, "Mom, we're struggling, Preston's family is in trouble, we need help," I would have helped. I might not have given them the house, but I would have done something. Because that's what family does, real family built on honesty and respect. But they hadn't trusted me with the truth. They'd looked at a 70-year-old widow and seen an easy mark. They'd calculated that it would be simpler to manipulate me than to respect me. I told Richard to proceed exactly as planned. At 9:30, I drove to the house. My house. I wanted to be there when it happened. I needed to see their faces when they realized that their scheme had failed completely. I parked across the street and watched. At exactly 10 o'clock, Richard pulled up in his Mercedes, followed by a sheriff's deputy in a patrol car. They walked to the front door together, and Richard knocked with the firm, official rap of someone who'd done this many times before. Preston opened the door. Even from across the street, I could see his face go pale when he saw the deputy. Richard handed him some papers. I knew what they were. The official noticed that their time was up and they needed to leave immediately. Preston tried arguing. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the gestures, the pointing, the raised voice, the aggressive body language of a man who still thought he could intimidate his way out of consequences. The deputy stepped forward and said something that made Preston step back immediately. Then Melissa appeared in the doorway. She saw Richard and the deputy, and her eyes immediately scanned the street. She was looking for me, looking to see if her mother had shown up to watch her humiliation. Our eyes met across the distance. I didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't give her anything at all, just held her gaze until she looked away. Gerald and Patricia emerged next, both talking at once, both gesturing wildly. Patricia was still in her silk robe. Apparently, the reality of the situation hadn't penetrated until this very moment. Gerald was red-faced, shouting something about lawyers and rights and injustice. The deputy said something sharp, and they all went quiet. Richard pulled out more paperwork, probably explaining that everything had been done by the book, that they had no legal recourse, that they needed to collect their essential belongings and leave now. I watched as they made multiple trips back and forth, loading belongings into that beat-up Honda and Gerald's Mercedes, which, I now noticed, had a dent in the passenger side and mismatched hubcaps. The car of a supposedly wealthy man who could no longer afford basic repairs. Each trip, they looked more defeated. Melissa was crying. Preston was stone-faced. Gerald kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe this was happening. Patricia had the expression of someone whose entire worldview had just shattered. It took them 90 minutes to clear out what they could carry. Richard had arranged for a storage unit where they could keep the rest of their belongings for 30 days, giving them time to find a place and retrieve everything. I was being more generous than they deserved, but I wasn't cruel enough to put their things on the curb. When they were finally done, Richard walked through the house with the deputy, documenting its condition. Then he came across the street to where I was sitting in my car. He told me the house was officially vacant and back in my possession. The locks would be changed within the hour. He asked me if I wanted to go inside now or wait. I told him I'd wait. I needed a few days before I could walk back into that space. Needed time to cleanse it of the betrayal that had happened within those walls. Richard nodded and told me he'd take care of everything. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. He mentioned that during the walkthrough, he'd found something in the master bedroom, a folder of documents that appeared to be related to loan applications and property valuations. He'd secured them as potential evidence of the scheme I'd described. I asked him to send me copies of everything. I wanted to see exactly how detailed their plan had been, how thoroughly they'd intended to betray me. The documents arrived via email that evening. As I read through them, my hands started shaking, not from weakness, but from rage that I'd been suppressing for weeks. They'd already started the loan application process, had property valuations done, had filled out paperwork listing Preston and Melissa as the owners' forged documents, essentially preparing for the day when they'd convince me to sign over the deed. They'd even selected which lender to use, one that Gerald apparently had a relationship with from his dealership business. There was a business plan for Preston's new venture, a restaurant concept that made me laugh bitterly. After watching me run successful restaurants for decades, after eating meals I'd prepared with 50 years of expertise, Preston thought he could open his own place with no experience and money borrowed against my property. The restaurant industry has a 70% failure rate in the first year. They'd been planning to risk my home on a venture that was almost guaranteed to fail, run by a man who'd just been fired from a sales job and had no culinary or business management experience. But the worst document was a handwritten note, unsigned but in Melissa's handwriting. I'd recognize it anywhere. It was a timeline, a plan. Step 1. Make Caroline uncomfortable enough to stop visiting. Step 2. Convince her she's becoming forgetful and needs to simplify her assets. Step 3. Present the property transfer as a gift to her daughter for estate planning purposes. Step 4. Use the equity to secure the loan before she realizes what's happened. They'd been planning to gaslight me, to use my age against me, to make me doubt my own mental capacity, to convince me that signing away my property was for my own good. My daughter had been willing to destroy my sense of self, to make me question my own mind, just to steal my house. I sat with those documents for hours, read them until I'd memorized every cruel detail. And I understood something I'd been trying to avoid. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't desperation leading to poor judgment. This was calculated, premeditated, and cold-blooded. Melissa hadn't just betrayed me. She'd been willing to psychologically abuse me to get what she wanted. That night, I called Andrea again, told her everything I'd discovered. She listened in silence, and when I finished, she said something that finally broke through the numbness I'd been feeling. She reminded me that this wasn't my fault, that I'd been a good mother to Good, probably, and that Melissa's choices were her own. She told me that protecting myself wasn't the same as abandoning my daughter. And she told me that Robert would be proud of the strength I was showing. I cried then, really cried, for the first time since that Sunday dinner. Not for what I'd lost, but for what had never really existed. The daughter I'd loved was an illusion. The real Melissa was someone I'd never truly known. But I was done mourning, done second-guessing, done feeling guilty for protecting myself from someone who'd planned my psychological destruction. Tomorrow, I had a meeting scheduled with a real estate agent. We were going to list the house, and I was going to sell it for every penny I could get. And Melissa wouldn't see a single cent. The real estate agent's name was Margaret Chunno, relation to Richard, though they knew each other professionally. She was 62, sharp as a tack, and had been selling high-end San Diego properties for 30 years. When I'd called to set up the meeting, I'd asked Richard for a recommendation of someone who wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions about why a woman my age was selling a house her daughter had been living in. Margaret, he'd assured me, was a professional who understood that every property had a story, and most of those stories were nobody's business but the client's. We met at the house 3 days after the eviction. I hadn't been inside since that terrible Sunday dinner, and walking through the door felt like entering a crime scene, which, in a way, it was. The house was a mess, not destroyed, but clearly abandoned in haste. Dishes in the sink, trash bags piled by the door, furniture moved around and left at odd angles. The bedroom that Gerald and Patricia had occupied smelled of expensive perfume and cigar smoke. Apparently they'd been smoking inside, despite knowing I'd forbidden it when I bought the place. Margaret walked through every room with me, taking notes, measuring, photographing. She didn't comment on the state of things, just made professional observations about the property's condition and what would need to be done before listing. When we finished the tour, we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd served that last dinner, and she gave me her assessment. The house would sell for somewhere between $820,000 and $850,000 in current market conditions. It needed deep cleaning, minor repairs, and staging, which she could arrange. She estimated 2 weeks to get it market ready, then another 4 to 6 weeks to close once we had a buyer. I asked her what she'd recommend I do with the furniture Melissa had left behind. Margaret looked at me carefully, and I could see her weighing whether to ask the obvious question. To her credit, she didn't. She simply told me I had 3 options: keep it, donate it, or include it in the sale as furnished. Most of it was inexpensive. Melissa had never been able to afford the quality pieces she'd wanted, so it wouldn't add significant value either way. I told Margaret to donate everything except a few specific items. I'd given Melissa over the years my grandmother's china cabinet, a quilt my mother had made, some family photographs that had been shoved in a closet. Those would go to Andrea. Everything else could go to charity. Let someone who actually needed furniture benefit from my daughter's abandoned life. We signed the listing agreement that afternoon. Margaret promised to have a cleaning crew and handyman there within 48 hours. The house would be on the market by the end of the month. As I was leaving, I took one last look at the kitchen where I'd cooked so many meals, the counter where I'd rolled out pie dough, the stove where I'd perfected Robert's lamb roast. That kitchen had been supposed to be filled with love and family and tradition. Instead, it had become the stage for my daughter's betrayal. I locked the door behind me and didn't look back. But selling the house wasn't the decisive resource I needed, it was just the beginning. What I needed was something that would ensure this situation could never happen again. Something that would protect not just my assets, but my dignity and autonomy for whatever years I had left. That evening, I met with Richard in his office. I told him I wanted to create an ironclad estate plan that would prevent any future manipulation. I wanted trusts, beneficiary designations, healthcare directives, financial power of attorney, everything structured so that no one could ever again try to use my age or grief or motherly love against me. Richard pulled out a yellow legal pad and started taking notes. We spent 3 hours going through every detail of my financial life. The investments from selling the restaurants, the life insurance payout from Robert's death, my retirement accounts, the house I was about to sell, my current condo, everything laid out with legal precision. Then Richard asked me the hard question. What did I want to happen with Melissa? I'd been thinking about this for days. The easy answer was to cut her out completely, leave everything to Andrea and charities. But Richard pressed me, was that really what I wanted? Would I regret it in 5 or 10 years? I told him something I'd realized during those sleepless nights reviewing documents and bank statements. I didn't want revenge. I wanted protection. And I wanted Melissa to really understand the consequences of her choices. So, we structured it this way. Andrea would be the primary beneficiary of everything, including my estate and any trusts. However, I would create a small trust, $50,000, that Melissa could access under one specific condition. She would have to provide documented proof that she'd sought professional help, therapy, financial counseling, whatever it took, and had spent at least 1 year working to address the behaviors that had led to this situation. It wasn't about the money. $50,000 was a fraction of what she would have inherited if she'd simply been honest and kind, but it was a test. If she actually did the work, actually tried to become a better person, she'd get something. If she didn't, if she was too proud or too entitled to admit she needed help, she'd get nothing. Richard asked what would happen if she never met the conditions. I told him that after 10 years, if she hadn't qualified, the money would go to a charity that helped elderly people fight financial exploitation. Let my daughter's inheritance fund protection for other people's parents. We also created something else, a document I'd never heard of before called a living declaration. It was essentially a statement, witnessed and notarized, describing exactly what had happened with Melissa, Preston, and his parents, not for legal purposes, but as a record. If anyone ever questioned my mental capacity or suggested I'd been confused or vindictive in my old age, this document would explain in my own words, while I was clearly competent, exactly why I'd made the choices I made. Richard had me write it out by hand. Every detail of the betrayal, the manipulation, the scheme to steal my property. The document was witnessed by Richard and his paralegal, both of whom confirmed I was of sound mind and acting without coercion. It was dated, notarized, and sealed. If Melissa ever tried to challenge my estate or claim I'd been mentally incompetent, this document would be opened and read in court. Her betrayal would become part of the public record. I signed everything that day. The new will, the trust, the power of attorney designating Andrea as my healthcare proxy, the living declaration, every document that would ensure I'd be protected and that the truth would be known. When we finished, Richard told me something I wasn't expecting. He said he'd known Robert for over 30 years, had watched us build our business and raise our family, and he'd never seen Robert as worried as he was in those final months. Robert had known something was wrong with Melissa, had seen warning signs that I'd missed or excused, and he'd spent his last weeks trying to protect me from what he knew was coming. Richard pulled out one more document, a letter Robert had left with him, to be given to me only if certain circumstances arose. Circumstances like Melissa betraying me or my needing to take action to protect myself. I read that letter sitting in Richard's office, tears running down my 70-year-old face. Robert had written it 6 months before he died, when he could barely hold a pen, and every word was filled with love and worry and wisdom. He told me he knew I'd try to see the best in Melissa long after she'd stopped deserving it. He told me that my capacity for forgiveness was one of the things he loved most about me, but that it was also my greatest vulnerability. He told me that if I was reading this letter, it meant something terrible had happened, and he needed me to know that protecting myself wasn't the same as failing as a mother. He wrote, "Caroline, you built an empire with me. You're stronger than you know. Don't let anyone, not even our daughter, make you forget that. And remember, family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who loves you even when it's hard. You deserve that kind of family." At the bottom, he'd added one more line. "I'll be watching over you. Make me proud." I folded that letter carefully and put it in my purse. It was the decisive resource I hadn't known I needed, not a legal document or a financial strategy, but permission from the man I'd loved for 54 years to be as strong as I'd always been. I left Richard's office that day with everything in place. My estate was protected. My wishes were documented, and I had Robert's blessing to do what needed to be done. But there was one more resource I needed to secure, one that had nothing to do with money or property. I needed allies, people who understood what had happened and would stand with me if Melissa tried to manipulate the narrative or turn family and friends against me. I started with Andrea. She flew out the following week, and we spent 3 days together, really together. Not just surface conversation, but deep, honest discussion about everything that had happened and everything we'd both lost by letting Melissa's toxicity dominate our family dynamics. Andrea told me about moments from their childhood I'd forgotten or never fully understood. Times when Melissa had lied to get her in trouble. Instances where she'd stolen Andrea's belongings and claimed they were hers. A pattern of behavior that had been there all along, but that I'd dismissed as normal sibling rivalry. We looked at old photo albums together, and Andrea pointed out something I'd never noticed. In almost every family picture, Melissa was front and center, demanding attention. Andrea was always at the edge, quiet and small. I'd thought Andrea was just shy. She told me she'd learned early that making herself invisible was easier than competing with her sister's constant need for the spotlight. I apologized to my younger daughter for not seeing, for not protecting her from Melissa's manipulation. Andrea told me there was nothing to forgive, that she'd built a good life despite everything, and that what mattered now was building something better going forward. We also talked about the future, about holidays and visits, and how we'd handle the inevitable awkwardness of Melissa's absence from family gatherings. Andrea made it clear. She supported my decisions completely. If Melissa wanted to repair things, she'd need to do the work. And until then, Andrea had no interest in maintaining a relationship with a sister who'd treated our mother so cruelly. Having Andrea's support meant everything. It meant I wasn't alone. It meant someone who knew the full truth would be there to confirm it if anyone questioned my version of events. The house went on the market 18 days later. Margaret had transformed it: professional cleaning, minor repairs, beautiful staging that made it look like a home someone actually cared about instead of a property people had abandoned in shame. We had 3 offers within the first week. I accepted the highest one, $842,000. Cash buyer, quick close, exactly what I needed. Melissa called me the day the for sale sign went up. I'd unblocked her number because I knew she'd see it eventually, and I wanted to hear her reaction. She was crying again, always crying when she wanted something. She asked me how I could do this, sell the house without even telling her, give away her home like it meant nothing. I reminded her, very calmly, that it had never been her home, that it had always been my property, and that she'd made it very clear she didn't consider me family, so what happened to my property was none of her concern. She tried another tactic then. Asked if she could at least have some of the furniture, some of the belongings she'd left behind. I told her that everything had been donated to charity except for family. Heirlooms that rightfully belonged to me and were now with Andrea. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Then she said something that confirmed everything I'd come to understand about who she really was. She told me I was a bitter old woman who would die alone, and that she hoped I was happy destroying my own family. I told her I hadn't destroyed anything. She had, and then I hung up and blocked her number again, this time permanently. The house closed escrow 33 days later. $842,000, minus fees and commissions, deposited directly into my account. Combined with what I already had, I was looking at a very comfortable retirement with more than enough to live well, travel if I wanted, and leave a substantial legacy to Andrea and the causes Robert and I had cared about. I was 78 years old, and I'd just proven that age doesn't mean weakness, that widowhood doesn't mean vulnerability, and that a mother's love, while deep, has limits that should never be crossed. Now it was time for the final confrontation, the moment when everyone would learn exactly what had happened and why. The call came from a number I didn't recognize on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the house sale closed. I almost didn't answer. I'd gotten into the habit of letting unknown numbers go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. It was Patricia, Preston's mother, the woman who'd sat at my table eating food I'd prepared for 6 hours, then waved me away like I was hired help. Her voice was different than I remembered, smaller and less imperious. She asked if she could meet with me, said it was important, that she needed to speak with me without Preston or Melissa knowing. Every instinct told me to refuse, but curiosity won out. I agreed to meet at the same coffee shop where I'd met Melissa. Neutral ground, public space, easy to leave if necessary. Patricia arrived looking nothing like the polished, judgmental woman who'd invaded my home. Her hair was gray at the roots. Apparently she'd stopped getting it colored. Her clothes were expensive but worn, the kind of outfit that speaks to former wealth now carefully maintained. She ordered black coffee, nothing fancy, and I noticed her hands shook slightly as she stirred in sugar. She started talking before I could say anything. Told me she needed me to understand what had really happened, that there were things I didn't know about Gerald's business situation. I stopped her right there and told her I knew exactly how bad things were. I'd done my research. That seemed to surprise her. She looked at me like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. And I could see the moment she realized she'd underestimated me completely. Then she told me something I hadn't known. Gerald was sick. Really sick. He'd been diagnosed with late-stage liver disease 6 months ago, cirrhosis, from decades of drinking that he'd hidden from everyone. He needed a transplant, but his insurance had lapsed when the dealerships started failing, and he wasn't eligible for the transplant list without proof he could pay for the anti-rejection medications that would cost thousands every month for the rest of his life. Patricia started crying, then real tears, not the manipulative kind I'd seen from Melissa. She said they'd been desperate, that they'd seen my property as their only chance to get Gerald the medical care he needed. The business loan Preston wanted wasn't for a restaurant, it was to use the house equity to secure funds for Gerald's treatment and to keep them from losing their last 2 dealerships. She told me that Preston and Melissa didn't even know about Gerald's diagnosis, that she and Gerald had kept it secret, let Preston believe the money was for his business venture, because they were too ashamed to admit they'd mismanaged everything so badly they couldn't even afford to keep Gerald alive. I sat there listening to this woman pour out her desperation, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not sympathy exactly, but a kind of weary recognition, because I understood being desperate to save someone you love. I'd watched Robert die slowly, and I would have done anything, given anything, to save him. But here's the difference, and I told Patricia this directly. I would never have stolen from someone else to do it. I would never have manipulated or deceived. I would have asked for help honestly, and if it wasn't given, I would have found another way. Patricia looked down at her coffee. She told me she knew what they'd done was wrong, but that she'd been out of her mind with fear of losing Gerald. She said Melissa had been the one to suggest the scheme initially had approached them with, the idea of getting me to sign over the house, and that she and Gerald had been too desperate to question it. This was new information. Melissa hadn't just been manipulated by Preston's family. She'd been the architect. I asked Patricia why she was telling me this now. What did she hope to accomplish? She said Gerald was getting worse, that without treatment, he had maybe 6 months left. That she was here to beg, actually beg me to reconsider helping them. Not with the house, since I'd already sold it, but with money. A loan, an investment in the dealerships, anything. She promised they'd pay me back. She promised Gerald would apologize personally. She even offered to testify against Preston and Melissa if I wanted to pursue legal action against them for the forged loan documents. I looked at this broken woman across from me, and I thought about Robert, about dignity and desperation, about the difference between asking for help and trying to steal it. I told Patricia I was sorry about Gerald's illness. I genuinely was. No one deserves to die slowly from a treatable condition just because they made bad financial decisions. But I also told her that their desperation didn't erase what they'd done, that treating me like an obstacle to be removed, allowing Melissa to throw me out of my own house, participating in a scheme to defraud me, those choices had consequences. I told her I wouldn't give them money, but I would give her something else, information. I explained about medical bankruptcy, about programs for uninsured patients, about charity care at teaching hospitals. I gave her the name of a social worker at UC San Diego Medical Center who specialized in helping patients navigate these systems. I told her that if they were truly desperate, there were legal avenues. They hadn't explored harder avenues, more humbling avenues, but avenues that didn't require destroying an old woman's sense of security. Patricia wrote down the information with shaking hands. Then she asked me one more question. Would I ever be able to forgive Melissa? I told her honestly that I didn't know, that forgiveness wasn't something you could force or fake, that Melissa had destroyed my trust so thoroughly, I couldn't even imagine what rebuilding it would look like. But I also told her something else. I mentioned the conditional trust I'd set up, the $50,000 Melissa could access if she did the work to become a better person. I told Patricia that if Melissa ever genuinely changed, if she ever truly understood what she'd done and worked to address it, there might be a path forward, but that it would have to be Melissa's choice. I couldn't force growth on someone who didn't want it. Patricia actually thanked me, with more sincerity than she'd ever shown when eating at my table. Then she left, looking even older than when she'd arrived. I sat there for a long time after she was gone, thinking about what she'd revealed. Melissa had initiated the scheme. My daughter hadn't been a victim of her in-laws' manipulation. She'd been the mastermind that night. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the timeline, trying to piece together when Melissa had stopped being the daughter I knew and become someone capable of orchestrating my betrayal. I pulled out old photographs, letters, cards she'd sent over the years, looking for the moment when things changed. But the truth was, there was no single moment. It had been gradual, so gradual I'd missed it entirely. Small betrayals that built into larger ones. Small lies that made bigger lies easier. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. I called Richard and told him about the meeting with Patricia. Asked him if the forged loan documents, the ones where they'd listed Preston and Melissa as owners of my property, constituted fraud. Richard confirmed they did. Real fraud. The kind that could result in criminal charges if I wanted to pursue it. I asked him what he recommended. Richard was quiet for a moment, then told me something that surprised me. He said that, in his experience, legal action rarely brought the satisfaction people expected. That criminal charges would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. That I'd spend years of my life reliving the betrayal instead of moving forward. But he also said there was value in having the option, in knowing I could pursue charges if needed. Sometimes, he explained, just knowing you have that power is enough. I decided to hold the documents as leverage, not to use maliciously, but as protection. If Melissa or Preston tried to come after me legally, tried to claim I'd defrauded them somehow or challenge my mental competency, I'd have proof of their criminal intent ready to present. 2 days after meeting with Patricia, I got a call from Preston. His voice was different, too defeated, exhausted. He asked if we could talk. I met him at the same coffee shop. Apparently it had become my unofficial office for confronting the people who'd betrayed me. Preston looked terrible. He'd lost weight, had dark circles under his eyes, and his expensive clothes hung loose on his frame. He told me Gerald was dying, that his father would be lucky to see Christmas. He said his mother had told him about their conversation, had explained how sick Gerald really was. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He apologized. Not the manipulative apology I'd gotten used to from Melissa, but what sounded like genuine remorse. He told me he'd been raised to believe that image mattered more than integrity, that maintaining appearances was more important than telling the truth. He said watching his father die while drowning in the consequences of decades of those lies had made him realize how destructive that philosophy was. He admitted that he'd treated me horribly, that he'd encouraged Melissa's worst impulses because it served his interests. That he'd been so desperate to fix his family's problems, he'd convinced himself that manipulating an elderly woman was somehow justified. I asked him the same question I'd asked Patricia. Why was he telling me this now? He said because he'd lost everything anyway, so he might as well lose it honestly. The truth, he explained, was that his marriage was falling apart, that Melissa blamed him for the eviction, blamed his parents for dragging them into this situation, blamed everyone except herself. That living with someone who couldn't take responsibility for her own actions was destroying what little he had left. He told me he was planning to leave her, that he'd already spoken to a divorce attorney, that he couldn't stay in a relationship built on lies and manipulation anymore. I studied his face, trying to determine if this was another manipulation. But what I saw was just exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who'd finally stopped running from the truth. I told Preston that I appreciated his apology, even if I couldn't fully accept it yet. I told him that what he did next would matter more than anything he said now. Then I asked him something I'd been wondering about since Patricia's visit. Had he known that Melissa initiated the scheme? He admitted he had. Said that 6 months after they'd moved into the house, Melissa had started talking about how it was unfair that the house was in my name, how I was controlling them with it. When his parents' financial situation got desperate, Melissa had been the one to suggest they could help everyone by convincing me to transfer the deed. She'd framed it as doing me a favor, simplifying my estate, reducing my stress, being a thoughtful daughter. Preston said he'd gone along with it because he was desperate to save his father and because Melissa had made it sound so reasonable. But as the plan evolved, as it became about pushing me out and forging documents, he'd started to feel sick about it. He'd tried to pull back, but by then Gerald and Patricia were counting on it. And Melissa told him he was betraying his own family if he backed out. So he'd stayed silent. And he'd watched as the woman who'd given them everything was systematically disrespected and dismissed in her own home. He told me he'd never be able to make it right, but that he wanted me to know the truth, that Melissa wasn't a victim of his family's schemes. She'd been a willing participant who'd protected herself by making it look like she'd been manipulated. I thanked Preston for his honesty. Then I told him something I'd learned in 78 years of life: rock bottom only works if you use it to build something better. That he had a choice now to become bitter about everything he'd lost, or to become better because of it. He nodded and left without saying anything else. I watched him walk away, this man who'd contributed to my betrayal, and I felt something like pity, because at least he'd finally admitted the truth. At least he'd stopped lying, which was more than I could say for my daughter. That evening, I sat in my condo thinking about everything I'd learned: Patricia's desperation, Preston's confession, and the reality that Melissa had been the driving force behind all of it. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving. Traditionally, this would be when our whole family gathered for a meal that took me 3 days to prepare. But this year, there would be no gathering. Andrea was coming to visit in December. Gerald was dying. Preston was leaving Melissa. And Melissa was about to learn that when you burn every bridge, you end up on an island all by yourself. The cracks in their alliance had become chasms. And I was about to make sure everyone knew exactly how those chasms had formed. I spent Thanksgiving alone, and it was the most peaceful holiday I'd had in 5 years. I made a small turkey breast, mashed potatoes for one, green beans the way Robert liked them. I set the table with the good china, the set that had belonged to his grandmother, the one I'd rescued from Melissa's house before everything was donated. I lit candles, I poured wine, and I sat in my small dining room and gave thanks for the things that actually mattered: my health, my clarity of mind, my freedom from people who saw my love as weakness. Andrea called from Florida. We talked for an hour, making plans for her December visit. She told me her kids, my grandchildren, wanted to meet me properly this time, without Melissa's drama overshadowing everything. We talked about starting new traditions, building something honest and real. After dinner, I did something I'd been planning for weeks. I sat down at my computer and I wrote everything out, every detail of what had happened, from the moment I bought that house 5 years ago to the revelation that Melissa had orchestrated the entire scheme. I wrote it clearly, chronologically, with dates and documentation. Then I sent it to 12 people. Family members who'd been asking questions about why Melissa and I weren't speaking, friends from the restaurant days who'd known us for decades, Robert's siblings who'd always been kind to me, even a few people from our church community who'd watched me raise Melissa and might be wondering what had happened. I titled it simply, "The Truth About What Happened." I wasn't trying to destroy Melissa's reputation, though I knew that would be a consequence. I was creating a record, making sure that when she inevitably told her version of events, the version where she was the victim of her cruel, vindictive mother, there would be people who knew the full truth. The responses started coming within hours: shock, support. Several people admitted they'd sensed something was wrong, but hadn't known how to ask. Robert's brother called me and said he'd suspected Preston was bad news from the beginning, that Robert had confided similar concerns to him before he died. My friend Margaret, not the realtor, but Margaret Wu, who'd worked with me at the second restaurant for 15 years, called crying. She told me she'd been in an almost identical situation with her own son, that she understood the particular pain of being betrayed by someone you'd sacrificed everything for. She said she wished she'd had my courage to set boundaries before it was too late, but the most important response came from someone I hadn't expected: Melissa's best friend from college, a woman named Dana, who I'd always liked but hadn't spoken to in years. Dana asked if she could come see me, said it was important and that she had something I needed to know. We met at my condo. I was done with coffee shop confrontations. Dana arrived with a bottle of wine and a folder of printed text messages. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure she was doing the right thing but felt compelled to do it anyway. She told me that Melissa had been saying terrible things about me for over a year, that she'd been telling friends I was becoming senile, that I was paranoid and controlling, that I'd always been emotionally manipulative and was getting worse with age. Dana had believed it at first. Why wouldn't she? Melissa was her best friend. But then Dana had come to visit 6 months ago, had stayed at the house for a weekend. She'd met Gerald and Patricia. She'd watched how they all treated me when I came over to cook Sunday dinner, and she'd realized something was very wrong. Dana showed me the text messages, conversations between her and Melissa, where Melissa talked about dealing with the Caroline problem, about how they needed to manage her expectations about the house, about how getting her out of their lives would solve everything. There were messages from the week before that final Sunday dinner. Melissa texting Dana, "Tomorrow we're finally telling her she's not welcome anymore. Preston's parents said they'll back us up. It's time to take control of our own house." Dana had responded asking if Melissa was sure that was a good idea, reminding her that I owned the property. Melissa's response, "She won't actually do anything. She's too old and weak and loves me too much. She'll cry and then forgive me like she always does." I sat there reading those messages, seeing my daughter's calculation laid out in black and white. She'd planned that Sunday deliberately, had coordinated with Preston's parents, had believed I was too old, too weak, too blinded by motherly love to ever stand up for myself. Dana told me she'd confronted Melissa after the eviction, had told her she was horrified by what she'd done. Melissa's response had been to cut Dana off completely, to tell everyone in their friend group that Dana was siding with a senile old woman against her own best friend. But Dana said she couldn't stay silent anymore, that reading my email explaining what had really happened had confirmed everything she'd suspected. She wanted me to have those messages as proof of premeditation, in case I ever needed them. I thanked Dana, told her that her courage in coming forward meant more than she could know. She hugged me before she left and told me that Melissa had been lucky to have me as a mother, even if she'd never appreciated it. The next morning, I called Richard, told him about Dana's messages, asked him if we needed to add them to my documentation. Richard said they were certainly helpful corroboration, but that we already had everything we needed. The deed in my name, the documented eviction, the forged loan applications, the timeline of financial transfers. It was all ironclad. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. Melissa had contacted him, had asked if there was any way to negotiate, to reach some kind of settlement that would give her access to funds or property from my estate. Richard had told her there was nothing to negotiate, that I'd made my decisions clearly and with full legal capacity, that any further attempts to contact me through him would be considered harassment. She'd tried to argue that I'd promised to meet with her again after the eviction, that I'd implied we might work something out. Richard had pointed out that I'd made no such promise, and even if I had, I wasn't obligated to follow through. After discovering the extent of her deception, Melissa had apparently broken down crying on the phone, claiming she was destitute and desperate. Richard had ended the call by reminding her that being the consequence of her own actions didn't make her a victim. I asked Richard if he thought I should feel guilty about Melissa's situation. He was quiet for a long moment, then told me something that perfectly captured what I'd been feeling. He said that there's a difference between causing someone suffering and declining to prevent it. That I hadn't destroyed Melissa's life, she'd done that herself. I'd simply refused to let her destroy mine in the process. He told me that in his 40 years practicing law, he'd seen countless families torn apart by entitlement and manipulation, that the parents who set boundaries were the ones who eventually rebuilt something healthier. The ones who kept enabling the bad behavior just prolonged the suffering for everyone. I'd set my boundary. Now, it was up to Melissa what she did with that. A week later, I got a registered letter. Not from Melissa, but from a law firm I didn't recognize. My heart sank. I assumed it was some kind of legal action against me. It wasn't. It was from Gerald's attorney, informing me that Gerald had died. The letter included a brief note from Patricia thanking me for the medical resources I'd provided. She said they hadn't been able to save him, but that he'd spent his last weeks reconciling with family and making peace with his choices. She said Gerald had asked her to make sure I knew he regretted his part in what had happened. I didn't cry for Gerald. I barely knew the man, and what I did know wasn't particularly admirable. But I acknowledged the death, sent a sympathy card to Patricia, and made a donation to liver disease research in Gerald's name. It was the kind thing to do. And just because Gerald's family had treated me badly, didn't mean I had to become bitter and cruel in return. Preston filed for divorce 2 weeks before Christmas. I know because he sent me a brief email letting me know, saying he thought I'd want to be aware before Melissa potentially reached out for sympathy or financial help. He told me he was moving back east to live with his sister while he figured out his next steps. That he was attending therapy to address the patterns of behavior he'd learned from his parents. That he hoped someday to be able to apologize more fully, but that he understood if I never wanted to hear from him. I appreciated the email. Appreciated that he was taking responsibility and doing the work to change. I didn't respond, but I acknowledged to myself that at least one person in this situation was trying to grow from it. And then came the call I'd been expecting but dreading. Christmas morning, at 6:30 in the morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Melissa's voice, broken and desperate. Mom, it's me. I know you probably won't even listen to this, but I'm calling anyway. Preston left me. His father died. I have no money, no job, nowhere to go. My friends won't talk to me. I'm completely alone. I know I don't deserve your help after everything I did, but I'm begging you, please, I'm your daughter. Doesn't that mean anything anymore? I listened to that message 3 times. Each time, I heard something different. The first time, I heard my daughter in pain. The second time, I heard manipulation in the specific words she chose. I'm your daughter, as if biology obligated me to rescue her. The third time, I heard what was actually missing. Any acknowledgement of what she'd actually done wrong. Any genuine apology. Any indication she understood why we were here. She'd said she knew she didn't deserve help, but she hadn't said why. Hadn't named the betrayal, the lies, the orchestrated scheme. She'd made herself the victim of circumstances, Preston leaving, Gerald dying, friends abandoning her, without taking responsibility for the choices that led to those circumstances. I didn't call her back, but I didn't delete the message either. I saved it, added it to the documentation of everything that had happened. Then I called Andrea, told her about the voicemail, asked her what she thought I should do. Andrea said something I'll never forget. Mom, you spent 78 years being the person who fixes things, who sacrifices, who puts everyone else first. You've earned the right to let someone else struggle with the consequences of their own choices. You're not abandoning Melissa. You're just refusing to be her safety net when she's never respected the sacrifice that safety net required. She was right. I'd spent my whole life catching people when they fell. But catching someone over and over again just teaches them they never have to learn to stand on their own. That afternoon, I did something I should have done months ago. I sat down and wrote a letter to Melissa. Not to send. I had no intention of sending it, but because I needed to articulate everything I felt, everything I'd learned. I wrote about love and boundaries, about how being a mother doesn't mean accepting abuse, about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, how I could forgive her for my own peace, but that didn't mean I had to let her back into my life. I wrote about the $50,000 trust I'd created, about the conditions I'd set. I explained that if she genuinely changed, if she did the hard work of becoming someone who could value people instead of using them, there might be a path forward. But that path had to start with her, not with me rescuing her from the consequences she'd created. I wrote about Robert, about how much he'd loved her despite seeing what she was becoming, about how his final acts had been to protect me from what he knew was inevitable. And I wrote about myself, about the woman I'd been generous to a fault, loving without conditions, willing to sacrifice everything for family, and about the woman I'd become, still loving, still generous, but finally wise enough to know that some people will take everything you give and demand more. I sealed that letter in an envelope and put it in my desk drawer. Maybe someday I'd send it. Maybe someday she'd be ready to read it. But today wasn't that day. I spent Christmas with my neighbors, a lovely couple in their 60s, who'd invited me over when they'd heard I'd be alone. We ate ham and played board games, and they told stories about their grandchildren. It was simple and honest and warm. As I walked back to my condo that evening, I realized something. I wasn't alone. I had Andrea. I had friends who'd stood by me when they learned the truth. I had a community of people who valued honesty and respect. And most importantly, I had myself. I had my strength, my clarity, my refusal to be diminished by people who'd underestimated me. At 78 years old, I'd learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, that protecting yourself doesn't make you cruel, that setting boundaries doesn't make you bitter, and that being someone's mother doesn't mean letting them destroy you. I'm 80 years old now. 2 years have passed since that Sunday dinner that changed everything, and I want to tell you what happened next, not because this story needs a tidy ending, but because life rarely works that way, and the truth is more valuable than comfort. The house sold. I took that $842,000 and invested it wisely. Robert taught me well. I travel now. Last year, Andrea and I went to Italy, walked through vineyards in Tuscany, ate pasta in small villages where nobody knew our story or cared about our past. Her children, my grandchildren, came to visit last summer. We baked cookies and I taught them some of Robert's recipes. They call me Grandma Caroline and send me drawings they make in school. I never heard from Melissa again after that Christmas voicemail. Well, that's not entirely true. I heard about her through mutual acquaintances, through the inevitable small-town gossip that happens even in a city as big as San Diego. She found work eventually, something in retail. She moved into a small apartment. She's surviving, which is what people do when they finally have to stand on their own. Preston apparently did go to therapy, did start rebuilding his life. He sent me a card on my 79th birthday, just a simple note, saying he hoped I was well, and that he was working on becoming someone his father wouldn't recognize. I appreciated that. Patricia sold the remaining dealerships and moved to Arizona to be near her sister. She sent me a Christmas card this past year with a brief note saying she was volunteering at a hospice, trying to give back after everything they'd taken. I don't know if that's redemption or just old age making us all softer, but I acknowledged the gesture. The conditional trust I set up for Melissa still sits there, untouched. $50,000 waiting for her if she ever does the work to earn it. Richard sends me an annual update so far. She hasn't attempted to meet the conditions. Maybe she never will. Maybe pride is more important to her than growth. That's her choice to make. I revised my will again last year. Andrea is still the primary beneficiary, but I added something new. A scholarship fund at the culinary school where Robert and I used to recruit young chefs. It's specifically for students over 50 who are starting second careers, because I've learned that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. People ask me sometimes if I regret how things turned out with Melissa, if I wish I'd handled it differently, been more forgiving, given her another chance. The honest answer is complicated. I regret that my daughter became someone capable of such cruelty. I regret that I didn't see the warning signs earlier, didn't set boundaries when she was younger. I regret that Robert died worrying about what would happen to me, but I don't regret protecting myself. I don't regret standing up for my own dignity, and I don't regret learning, finally, that love without respect isn't really love at all. Here's what I've learned in 8 decades on this earth. Family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up, who values you, who treats you with the basic human decency that every person deserves, regardless of age or relationship. I've also learned that being old doesn't mean being weak. That widow doesn't mean victim. That mother doesn't mean martyr. I spent so many years defining myself by what I could give, what I could sacrifice, what I could provide. It took losing almost everything to understand that my worth wasn't in what I gave, it was in who I was. The women of my generation were taught to put everyone else first, to make ourselves small so others could be comfortable, to absorb cruelty and call it love. I did that for 78 years, and all it got me was a daughter who thought I was too weak to fight back. But I did fight back. Not with cruelty or revenge, just with boundaries and truth. And you know what? The sun still rose, the world kept turning, and I discovered that life on the other side of that boundary was actually better, clearer, more honest, more peaceful. I think about Robert every day, about what he sacrificed to protect me even after death, about how he knew, somehow, that this was coming and made sure I'd have the tools to survive it. I visit his grave every Sunday, the same day I used to spend cooking for people who didn't appreciate it. Now I bring flowers and tell him about Andrea's kids, about my travels, about the life I'm building in the space that betrayal left behind. And sometimes I tell him I'm sorry it took me so long to become the woman he always believed I was, strong enough to love deeply, but wise enough to know when to walk away. If you're watching this and you're in a similar situation, if someone in your family is taking advantage of your love, using your age against you, treating you like an obstacle instead of a person. I want you to hear this. You are not too old to set boundaries. You are not too weak to protect yourself. And refusing to be mistreated doesn't make you cruel, it makes you wise. I'm 80 years old. I've buried a husband, lost a daughter, survived betrayal I never imagined possible. And I'm still here. Still strong. Still building a life that has meaning and dignity and love, real love. The kind that goes both ways. That Sunday dinner 2 years ago wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of finally putting myself first. The beginning of understanding that respect isn't negotiable. And the beginning of the rest of my life, however long that may be, lived on my own terms. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And please subscribe to this channel, because every grandmother has a story that deserves to be heard, and I'll be sharing more of mine. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to be diminished. Sometimes the greatest act of love is loving yourself enough to walk away. And sometimes, at 78 or 80 or any age, you get to start over and build something better than what you lost. I'm Caroline Henderson. I'm 80 years old, and I'm just getting started.